When nations fall, the world does not cheer. It recalibrates. Borders bend. Loyalties shift. And the map, like memory, forgets what was never supposed to change. In the silence that followed Britain's collapse, no bombs fell, but something louder arrived. Absence, not just of empire, but of expectation, of order, of what came next. Across the empire, men stood in uniform, but not in unity. Some waited, some watched, and others began to wonder who, if anyone, they were still fighting for. And in Cairo, the ground stirred first, not in noise, but in nods, in names, in secrets not shouted, but shared. It doesn't take an army to light a fire, just a signal, a whisper if the air is dry enough. In Cairo, the kindling had waited patiently. Flags, fuel, memory. And then, spark met silence, and from the rooftops, a new kind of order began to glow. A monarchy's emblem, set alight not with fury, but with choreography. It was scheduling, not chaos, and the empire's last command post drafted its final memo in smoke. They called it unrest. They always do. But I called it what it was. The Cairo Coup de Grâce. The first betrayal was quiet, a badge removed, not torn. But in that silence, something shifted. Law bent toward loyalty and away from London. Cairo had seen anger before, but never without fear of the crown. That fear, like the men behind the gates, was no longer standing. By dusk, the voices had a leader, and the city had chosen a language louder than diplomacy. Fire. When the Italian fleet appeared, there were no sirens, no resistance, only applause echoing down colonial alleys. Not for Mussolini, but for what his presence meant, that Rome had arrived, and London was gone. To the crowd, it wasn't surrender, it was subtraction. To Mussolini, Cairo was not a conquest, it was a stage, and in front of the pyramids, the actor played Caesar, to an audience too exhausted to protest. Germany sent no speeches, only steel, in crates, in codes, in quiet men who spoke no Arabic, but understood conquest in any tongue. And from the east came silence, Soviet minds in civilian clothes. They offered no flags, no slogans, just options. Options that bled. No broadcasts broke the stillness. No crowds filled the streets. But in that room, below the noise, the war began to shift. Not with armies, with allocations. And when Roosevelt closed that door, the front lines moved. Not in Europe, not in Asia, but inside the calculus of a man who knew when to hold and when to wager. And when the fog reached American shores, the chamber finally answered, not in debate, but in declaration. For once, war had not been invited, but chosen. There was no treaty, no signature, just a shared silence between predators. One would take the east, the other the rest, and neither would look away. They did not gather in Berlin, nor in Rome, nor in Moscow, but in the shadow of monuments that had outlasted empires. No ceremony, only a silence shared by those who knew the old world was ending, and the next would be carved in sand and fire. Some would later call it a triumvirate, but in that moment it was only gravity, the kind that forms when ambition forgets fear and begins to orbit itself. And as Cairo fell quiet beneath their boots, the world saw not a new empire, but the shape of its undoing, etched in silence and paved straight to the Suez and the shipping lanes that could cripple the Allies' war machine. They didn't come to conquer New York, only to see it, to let its skyline reflect in the eye of a scope, and know that the ocean was no longer a wall. By dawn it had vanished. No disruption, no punches thrown, just a ripple, the kind that reaches no shore, but changes the shape of every coast. In Washington, disbelief. In New York, something colder. Not invasion, not war. Just the first prick of something foreign inside the bloodstream. The first blow came with no trumpet, no proclamation, just the whine of altitude and the silence that followed detonation. They struck the radar first, then the rails, then the officers still finishing breakfast. By the time the sky cleared, the ground had already changed sides. It had begun weeks before, in the shadowed heat of Sudan. Not with speeches, but with strategy. Maps were redrawn by hands, no longer polite. And for all their scars, the Allies still knew how to plan a storm. When the Spanish fleet pulled south, the Allies mistook it for retreat. It wasn't. The mines had been placed days before. The artillery was already zeroed. The canal welcomed its liberators with fire. But retreat has its limits, and so does denial. The US Navy arrived. It brought everything. Destroyers, aircraft carriers, dive bombers, and the memory of a world not yet surrendered. The first strike wasn't cautious. It was calculated violence. Fleets surged. Carriers launched. Skies lit up in response. One torpedo. One ship gone. Then another. Command fractured. Orders drowned. By midday, the Axis line didn't sway. It sank. And the last thing they saw was the Eagle. They struck at Ras Karib, quietly, decisively, and didn't stop until Ismailia was in range. This wasn't about Cairo. It wasn't about headlines. It was about the canal. The axis held its center, and with it, the arteries of empire. Trade stalled. Reinforcements slowed. The war itself began to constrict. So the Americans brought weight, armor, artillery, precision, and in Ismailia, that weight was made permanent. It wasn't symbolic, it was structural. The kind of victory you don't frame on a wall, because you built the next campaign on top of it. They raised the flag over what was left. A checkpoint half burning, a tower half fallen. It was not a triumph, but the canal flowed again. And that, for now, was enough. Exile is not silence, and though his island was lost, his words were not. Across shortwave and sky, the old lion roared again. The rifles were still German, the flags still foreign. Some called it order, some even called it home. But in alleyways and kitchens, new plans were forming. They carried no uniforms, only names, secrets, ink. In Vichy's shadow, the resistance stirred. The northern wall had fallen. U-boats prowled the coast. So they answered, not with hesitation, but with hull and thunder. The Atlantic would remember who it belonged to. And far from the thunder they chased, the silence began to lean forward. Momentum favors the Allies, but tyrants never lead quietly. The fire has only just begun.